And this is the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 20th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, 'Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first.' When those hired about 5 o'clock came, all of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.' But he replied to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?' So the last will be first, and the first will be last." The Gospel of the Lord. Back in the 1940s, a mathematician and an economist wrote a book entitled The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. And in that book, they introduced the term zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is a game in which the gains of one player are exactly offset by the loss of another player. That is, if I win, you lose. And if you win, I lose. The sum of the wins and the losses total zero. And of course, a lot of games are zero-sum. Often, for one person to win, another person has to lose. If one person wins a sum of money, another person has to lose that sum of money. And if one team benefits from something, another team is penalized for that thing. So with that book, the term zero-sum was introduced into common vocabulary, and it was applied not only to games and economics, but to other areas of life. For indeed, there are a lot of things in life that are, or at least can be, zero-sum. It's true that if two people are competing for a job, one will get the job and the other won't. If you have an hour to do two things that each take an hour, one will get done and one will not. And as we get ready to vote soon, we know that for each position, one candidate will win and the other will lose. Life, in some cases, is zero-sum. But it isn't always like that. There are indeed many situations in which more than one person can win, the so-called win-win situation. So, if you hire somebody to do an important job and they do that thing for you and they get paid, both of you win. You got the thing you wanted and they got paid. Both parties win. There are situations in which both parties end up losing. You know, some of us are old enough to remember the nuclear age concept of mutually assured destruction, when the United States and the Soviet Union realized that if either one of them lit off nuclear missiles and both of them shot at each other, the entire world would be engulfed in nuclear winter. Everybody would be a loser. And there are other situations, especially situations which involve important interpersonal relationships, which can be damaged beyond repair simply by thinking about them in the transactional terms of who's winning and who's losing. One of the problems that our society faces is that we often reactively approach all situations as zero-sum situations. We often have a bias to think that for one of us to win, somebody else has to lose. And sometimes that can be really harmful. But while the term zero-sum is relatively new, the idea is as ancient as people. Zero-sum thinking is why Jonah is all bent out of shape in today's first reading. Jonah had been shown immense mercy and forgiveness by God. Now, it just seemed to Jonah that somebody else, preferably the people of Nineveh, whom he hated, should be on the receiving end of God's wrath. Jonah won. Therefore, Nineveh should lose. And even though Jonah said, this is what I told you, I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger, and he still believed that somehow somebody should lose because he had won. And zero-sum thinking is why the workers in the parable are finally all upset with the landowner. Because after all, everybody, including the earliest workers, got what they were promised. Nobody lost a cent of their salary. But somehow, if the latecomers also won, then it must be that the early birds had somehow lost. It's just the way things are supposed to work when you're thinking zero-sum. Now, like many parables, Jesus says something startling to make a point. And what's startling, of course, is that this would never work in real human life. The next day, nobody would get up and work for the landowner until the very last hour. That's just how things work with people. And that's why Jesus uses this startling image to show us that this is not how things work with God. God does not think in zero-sum terms about us, and he doesn't act that way. And while the folks in Jesus' time to whom he was speaking should have known this at least from the time of Jonah, Jesus told this parable to them, and he tells it to us, so that we remember that God's love, mercy, and forgiveness are not zero-sum. God's love and forgiveness and mercy for me does not in any way diminish God's love, forgiveness, and mercy towards you, and the other way around. Now, it's often easy to say those things. We sing them in our hymns. We talk about them, but somehow it's hard to keep that in our hearts and minds, especially when we encounter other people who we don't really think deserve it. See, this is what Jonah thought. This is what the early workers in the parable thought. Yeah, it's fine for God to show love and mercy. I mean, to somebody like me who so desperately deserves it. But not to those other people. Somehow, there's got to be some kind of way in which those people lose, or I can't win. But that's not the way God works. Even though it means kind of standing on our heads everything that we think about the way often our world works around us. Jesus told this parable to call his first hearers and us to make an effort to reflect God's love and mercy, that non-zero-sum way of behavior, by living in ways that are not zero-sum with others. And often, that means resisting this common idea that floats around us all the time, that to love or care for one group of people, that means that I have to somehow not love or denigrate some other group. That is, I can care about black lives and still care about blue lives. One doesn't have to lose for the other to win. I can advocate for other people's rights without feeling threatened that somehow I'm going to have to give up my rights because of that. That's not the way it's supposed to work. More often than not, the way we live together does not have to be zero-sum, as long as we don't approach it in that way. And Jesus told this parable to his first hearers and to us to remind us to resist the temptation to relate to other people in transactional terms. That is, to approach other people and think, how can I win against this person? Or how can my group beat that group? A couple of weeks ago, we remembered the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. For those of us who remember that day vividly, it all seemed kind of like yesterday. But among the many pictures and the thoughts that were expressed on social media, one that stood out for me was one that said, "As bad as September 11th was, I wish today we could be more like the people we became on September 12th." So I remember those days too. I remember a couple of days after that attack when every single member of Congress, conservatives, liberals, Republicans, and Democrats, all walked out on the front steps of the Capitol, joined hands, and sang "God Bless America." It was a moment that everybody in our country felt like we were all in this together, and nobody was going to get left behind. That's what it feels like when we're not living in a zero-sum society. Now, there's always going to be parts of our lives that are zero-sum. And if we're just playing a game, sometimes that can be fun and interesting. But because it is so tempting to revert to zero-sum ways of thinking and living, Jesus wants us always to remember that God does not work that way with us. Jesus calls us to reflect that reality in the ways that we live and relate to others. And Jesus calls us to look for and live in ways that do not require somebody to lose so that somebody else can win.